It's been almost 2 years since former Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson stepped to the podium at the White House on the day Lehman Brothers went under.
What we're going through in the short term doesn't make anything easier. But in the longer term, it's going to make things better because we've got excesses we need to work through, and we need to work through them as quickly as possible. And I think we're making progress.
The government answer? The Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP, a fancy name for a $700 billion bailout. Originally designed to buy up mortgage-backed securities, Paulson announced a dramatic shift in the program just 2 months later.
We asked for $700 billion to purchase troubled assets from financial institutions. At the time, we believed that would be the most effective means of getting credit flowing again. In consultation with the Federal Reserve, I determined that the most timely, effective step to improve credit market conditions was to strengthen bank balance sheets quickly through direct purchases of equity in banks.
So where did a big chunk of that money ultimately go? Financial institutions got almost $320 billion. The auto industry took home $81 billion. Homeowner programs received $27 billion, and other financial programs raked in close to $26 billion. But just managing TARP now requires the services of 22 law firms, 15 financial firms, and an operating budget of $1.5 billion just so far, and monthly expenses of around $133 million. That's a lot of money. But did TARP do the job that it was supposed to do? That's what we want to ask here. Dylan Ratigan is the host of the Dylan Ratigan Show here on MSNBC, and Christian Weller is a senior fellow with the Center for American Progress. Christian, before we unleash Dylan here, let me ask you a simple question. Did TARP work?
It worked. You got to remember what it was designed to do. It was truly an emergency measure. It was sort of the emergency brake in this free fall that the financial markets were in late 2008. And the idea was to really stabilize financial markets, to ultimately get the banks to lend to each other again. When you look at all of the data, it really looked like the market was completely stalled in 2008, and that would have brought down not just the financial institutions, but ultimately the economy. We now have the estimates that TARP itself has saved about 10 million jobs, and I think that's probably right on target. But you got to remember the primary purpose of this was to stabilize financial markets, and that's exactly what it did.
Yeah. All right. I don't even have to ask you a question. Dylan, go.
Well, I actually completely agree with Christian insofar as TARP and the rest of the financial relief programs clearly stabilized the financial system. They clearly worked in the sense of creating a functioning banking system where you can speculate and accumulate leverage and all the rest of it. But I kind of tie it, Cenk, to a situation where let's say I had you tied up to the bottom of your bathtub underwater and you can't breathe, and I stuck a snorkel in the water to see if you could breathe, and then you say, well, did the snorkel work? And I'd say, well, yes, you can breathe again, but it fails to address the fact that the reason that what's going on while TARP is working for the financial institutions is that we are not getting lending to Americans. We are not getting investment in America. We are simply getting lots of lending and speculation between the banks again, which is great for them and bad for everybody else, as far as I can tell.
Christian, that's an interesting point. Hold on, let me ask you. Because we lost 8 million jobs. You know, we're not getting lending. Wasn't that the whole point in the first place, to improve the economy, et cetera? So doesn't Dylan have a good point there?
Well, there are a number of things here that we have to keep in mind. The economy has certainly turned a corner where the economy is growing, has been growing for a year. There is strong private sector investment going on. We have lending. Lending actually started to recover earlier before the economy started to recover. So the financial markets stabilized. Not just interest rates came down and risk premiums came down, but lending actually happened. There are some parts of the sector economy where lending could be better. But the problem is, what we've learned through TARP is that there is a lot of messy legal wrangling when it comes to mortgages and other stuff that weren't that easily resolved, and TARP just simply couldn't have done that. I mean, you look at the homeowners in particular, dealing with the troubled mortgages in particular is a legal mess, not just a financial mess. And that ultimately led, for instance, Paulson to switch focus from buying up bad mortgages to simply giving the money to the banks, because it was the quickest way of dealing with it.
A question for you about the economy, Christian, when you talk about the economy recovering, and I don't disagree that the GDP and obviously investment, anybody who owns a bunch of robots, anybody who's good at financial speculation or hires Chinese slaves is making a small fortune once again. But my view at this point, sincerely, is that while the government and Geithner and Summers and all the rest of the economic policy groups are managing for the resurrection of the GDP, that the GDP in this country is a function of outsourced labor, financial speculation, and automation that is good for the owners of those things, which is a very small percentage of the people in this country, and it's actually being made at the expense of great jobs for Americans and great investment in America. Am I wrong in observing that the GDP, which once led to job creation, is now actually a function of job destruction?
Well, there's two things here. One is we do need to have strong GDP growth in order to actually create millions of jobs that we've lost. The other part is when you look at
But you're not answering my question. If the GDP growth is coming by...
Let me answer.
But how do you reconcile GDP growth that comes through destroying jobs?
Well, but at this point, we don't really have job destruction. We have job growth in the private sector.
Well, I disagree with that. We've destroyed so many jobs the past 3 years by virtue of the capital extraction that led to the bailout. You tell me we haven't lost jobs. Tell that to the people that have been fired over the past 3 years.
Well, Christian, before you answer, I really want to get to the heart of this thing, right? The 8 million jobs are still gone. They're still not back.
We need 30 million more.
Isn't that the ultimate problem here? And they're not lending. I mean, you mentioned earlier that they're lending a little bit, but now we have to do new programs to send money to community banks so that they'll actually lend to small businesses.
So much more
Wasn't that the whole point of TARP in the first place?
Again, I think you need to really separate the two issues. One was the immediate financial stability. The next one is to really make sure that the snorkel. But the next one is to get us out of the water, to really create the jobs. And the thing is, if you look at the timing, the economy has really turned the corner. The labor market has turned the corner. And when it comes to the economy, when it comes to the economy, what you really see at this point, it's the real economy that's doing well. I'm not disputing the fact.
Where do you see that? I'm not trying to be difficult. Where do you see that? And where do you see the job creation? Worse, we need to add 320,000 jobs a month for the next 3 years to get back to 6%.
You need to let me finish. You need to let me finish here. When you look at the things, like what really is going well is manufacturing, it's industrial production, it's also
by what measure?
Industrial production indications, the hiring is going well, better than at any point since the late 1990s in the manufacturing sector. Investment is going stronger than at any point since the late 1990s. So clearly, and by investment I mean capital expenditures, build new buildings, new offices, new factories. Those kinds of things are going the right direction.
In our country or in China?
No, they're going here. Now,
okay, look, Christian, last question for you, because we got to go. But Christian, I got to ask you a last question.
We need more capacity in manufacturing, and that's clearly the
right. If in a year from now we don't have any of that, the unemployment is still relatively where it is, etc., will you say, oh my God, we screwed up, we should never just given that money to the banks with no strings attached?
No, I think the evidence at this point is clear that this was a necessary temporary emergency measure, but that means at this point we really need to focus on the job at hand, and that is creating millions of jobs that we've lost, and that means rebuilding manufacturing capacity. Clearly, things are going the right direction, but they could be a lot better.
I just don't understand how the incentive is to take capital out of the system and speculate with it. How on earth anybody would... If you and I ran a bank, Christian, why would we lend or invest to anybody when we could just run an internalized game like MetLife was running against the soldiers, or like any bank in this country can run using the U.S. Treasury? There's no incentive to take the risk. It's good to get rich. I can buy a boat. I'll buy a boat. You can come on my boat with me.
I would love to be on that boat. Yeah. But what you need is, at this point, you need to have good regulation that prevents excessive speculation. But the important thing is not...
Well, we all agree on that.
They didn't do it.
We just passed the financial regulatory reform bill that was meant to do that.
But we all agree. We got agreement. We're all against excessive speculation, and we're all going on Dylan's boat.
We're going on the boat. If I steal a bunch of money, you're invited on my boat.
All right, Christian Weller and Dylan Ratigan, thank you guys.